One of the things that you talked about in the book was why you called the book Watershed Redemption.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. It actually came from when I was at Standing Rock and I was helping out cooking, and people were singing that Bob Marley piece, Redemption songs,
Uh-huh.
right? And how does it go? Do you remember how the words go? But it's there, it's in there. It's all I've ever had, redemption songs.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt at that moment that that's really all we have. That our intention, our pure purpose in making this world a better place, and it comes from our hearts. We don't know where it will lead, and we not only redeem whatever we've done on this earth that's destroyed ecologies, but in our own personal ecology, our own bodies, we can make that change. We set our intention and we can make that change. So the whole book is really a redemption song.
The origin of the book came out of loss.
It did.
It was just this
Right.
whole series of losses.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I came out of New York, came to see my parents. They were not doing well. And my sister's ex-husband burned her house down and a bunch of other things and went to prison. And I was very connected to the Klamath. And there was something about the river that really called me, and very loud every time I'd see it. So I started traveling it. And then I began to connect to the loss of the salmon for the salmon nations and the loss of so much in these lands that are so intrinsically beautiful. So I began to look at what was going on, who's doing what, how can we change this? And then I connected with people who were working on dam removal, which is about to happen, where there's actually the first contractor's been signed up for the dam removals on the Klamath. So it's been a long story. It led me to many things. It also led me to study other water places, watersheds around the country, also where I had a personal connection. And I wanted to speak with people who have been doing things for a long time, not just the latest news item, but people have stuck with it, who've been dedicated, strong leaders, maybe quiet leaders. A lot of them are quiet leaders. Some were scientists, some have incredible stories of how they, like one guy came out of East LA, he'd been in gangs, there were death threats. He left without telling anybody where he's going. He went to his grandparents in Missouri, in the upper Mississippi watershed. They lived like it was still the Depression. They composted, they fished, they just lived very simply. He learned from them. That man went on to start these stream teams in Missouri. I don't know how many there are now, but at the time there were 70,000 people involved in cleaning up the streams of Missouri because of him. So those stories were important. They give hope. They can show the power of that strong intention. Our redemption song.
How did you find these people? It's almost like you were involved in some sort of magnetic attraction process.
Yes, for
and
sure.
I know how that goes, that, you set out with an intention and then things
Right.
start to constellate that you would not necessarily have expected.
Definitely.
So talk a little bit about how that process went, that you began to travel and you had this intention and you wanted to study and learn and meet people, how that came
and
about.
I traveled with almost no resources. Every once in a while I get a little bitty grant. But mostly people gave me something. They would give me a place to stay or food for the road, or one person fixed my car, things like that. And I did talk to people as I went along. I would I met people along the Rio Grande, the border, who I would never have talked to in a million years. And they weren't specifically river savers, but they had a strong love of the land. I found that everywhere you go. So different people would point me to other people. That was part of it. Or I would chance upon a really interesting article and call the person. And that would lead to the next thing. So it was very much nonlinear. It was a nonlinear process of following what I call a strong resonance. And especially I would bring up the issue of, what do we do? How do we change the situation? And yeah, the government was horrible then too.
Right. The government has not ever had a history of necessarily caring about things.
At certain levels of it, but I find at the ground level where, say an EPA guy or a ranger has been doing the work for a long, long time. They're very knowledgeable. They keep their heads low so they're not involved in the politics so much. And those people still exist. They're everywhere. And those were the people I felt a connection to. And they would lead me to other things. This one man in Big Bend, he'd been a Big Bend ranger. Marcos Paredes is his name. He was really interesting. He'd been a river guide. And then he got into the National Park Service, and they wanted to promote him up the ranks, and he didn't do it. He said, I'm not going to do it. Because he knew he could be more effective if he stayed on the ground. So he was involved in a lot of Mexico and national parks and other things, collaborations. He taught a lot of the people who were in the Mexican version of the EPA, and they helped preserved, I think helped preserve about 3 million acres altogether, both sides of the Rio Grande. So this has been going on and still goes on. You don't hear about it in the national news, the noise of the national news. This is below the noise, and it's beautiful.
That these people exist and that they have this sense of mission to take care of the land and take care of the water, do something about cleaning things up.
Yes, and teach each other. They were really great. One story Marcos Paredes told me about the Mexican lead, a good friend of his. This man went to a conference. It was about invasive species. And they were just pouring money into this thing. And the guy said, for the money it took to get everybody to this conference, I think I could figure out how to handle this invasive species myself. And he did. He figured out a method, low cost, just a few people could do it. Anybody could do it, but he could do it with a small team. So that goes on. Again, it's not news. No one's going to hear about it.
So one of the things that's interesting also about your book is the way that the different areas you traveled to connect to your own past.
Yes.
Like there's a sort of a personal story and a bit of history running through all of these places in terms of your connection to them. Was that intentional, or did you just think about it afterwards, or how did that come about?
I felt that I needed to feel a place personally, deeply personally, and not just to visit like a tourist. So I picked places that would be a diversity of watersheds and issues, and also places I had lived or had a strong connection in some way, because I had a relationship to the land, the people. That was intentional, and then I went through a period where people were giving me advice. They'd see bits of writings, and some people would say, I want more of your personal story, and others would say, forget the personal story, right? And I know one group I read too, I was reading about the Hudson, and there was a time I lived there, I was married, and our marriage came to an end. And I don't say much about that, except it came to an end. Well, all of the women wanted to know, how did it end?
Right.
What happened?
Right.
And all the men are like, whatever. I mean, seriously, it was very gender split. And I just made my own decisions about
Right.
what's the important story thread
Uh-huh.
here. You know, why did I keep moving upriver? Well, that was part of it. My life kept changing, and I moved upriver like the fish moved upriver. So the fish actually were more important to me
Uh-huh.
than, you know, I moved on from that marriage. I went on to so many other things.
Right.
So, you know, I really pretty much kept it to what I thought was important, with personal story mixed in.
Well, there is, both in terms of your own personal history and in terms of the history of how we got here, an aspect of the story that has a hinge to history.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that you spoke about when you were talking about how to deal with the connection to indigenous people and indigenous lands was the way that the doctrine of discovery was
Yes.
built into how
Yeah.
history played out.
Right. It's still doing it.
You know, there's so many broken promises and mixed feelings there. Did you encounter Native people and their story in your travels?
Oh, always. It's always my first question. Who was here before me?
Uh-huh.
Who came here and why? Who was displaced? Who was murdered? Who, you know, who built something wonderful? You know, I was especially interested in coalitions of people. So like on the Klamath, all the different groups came together with a lot of difficulty, but they did. So, you know, tribal people, environmentalists, local farmers, ranchers, hippies. It's quite the interesting mix of whoever lives on the river and loves it. And there was a lot of work breaking through those barriers, seeing one's own history of pain and another person's history of pain. So there are very moving stories about that.
Well, that in itself is very fascinating to me because it's a big topic today, the way that everyone is becoming tribal and everybody's split and everybody's divided and nobody can get along. And what you're saying is that maybe in this particular case there's some sort of common ground that can bring people together enough to create some transformation.
Well, common ground can be found. I mean, we're too busy with the stories of division. So don't give them any more energy.
Right.
You know, yes, stand up for what's just and right, but also put your hands to what will make a beautiful change and work with people and be honest. Be really honest about what you're about.
That's really interesting, that part about being honest. It seems like one of the big obstacles to people getting along is the disingenuousness of the conversation.
Right.
And
Well, we protect ourselves.
Right.
Everybody does.
right.
But when they were working on the Klamath, there were these Chadwick sessions I wrote about, where they did a lot of exercise around, you know, who are we really? And people got to know each other in a way that wasn't simply, you know, working out a line of a settlement agreement. That came later. But, you know, your grandmother died. Oh, your son is graduating. Oh, you're like me. We're alike. Or some of the farmer ranchers who sometimes take a hard line when they were in those sessions. They found out what had happened, the history of tribal people, and they were shocked and heartbroken over it, in fact, and began to cry. So, and one man, for example, he just spontaneously apologized. Even, you know, the usual thing is, oh, I didn't do it, the ancestors did, or whatever.
Right.
But he open-heartedly apologized for his whole line, all of his ancestors.
Right.
And that made a difference.
Well, it makes a difference when people can acknowledge what's true.
Yeah.
That's needs to be done more, those
So-
acknowledgments. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the idea of environmental justice, because that's a
Yeah.
kind of justice that extends to non-human species.
It does. Yes.
So tell me what your feelings are about that. That's something that means something to you.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I got more of an education in environmental justice when I went to Atlanta, Georgia. I was working on the issues of the Chattahoochee River.
Mm-hmm.
And I focused a lot on the CDC and infectious diseases of that river, but also the usual question I have: who was here first? What was going on? Who's been harmed and who's been doing wonderful things and who's collaborating.
Mm-hmm.
So I met some fantastic people in West Atlanta, the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, and these are environmental justice leaders. One of them came out of the civil rights movement. He was young during that, and they brought all of those principles right into environmental justice, where there's actually environmental racism going on. Dumping in Dixie is a well-known book. Taking all the toxins and putting it in the poor black neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
or dumping them somewhere that the elite will never see.
Right.
Although they are, because these days it's so pervasive, the dumping, but it's much more so in poor communities,
Mm-hmm.
or people of color communities, or places where people are less likely to fight back.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those places was on the Rio Grande. Actually, the company wanted to dump waste from New York and also from nuclear reactors in New England, and so they went down, studied the area, and they said, they are not educated, they speak Spanish, they won't know what we're doing. Well, little did they know, this crowd educated themselves. They had leaders jump up, and it wasn't just about the people, the land, the children. It was also about all of the wildlife. So environmental justice, the first Congress on environmental justice explicitly included all of wildlife, and as important, and if you're mistreating one group because of greed, anger, and delusion, you're mistreating them all. And that extends to like the silvery minnow of the Rio Grande, the Mexican wolf of the Gilas, to the condors, to everything.
Right.
And I came out of writing this book and going, I want to dedicate myself to wildlife and wildlands protection. So if we can do that, we can save a lot more than that. We can, preserve half Earth, as E.O. Wilson calls it. That will make a huge difference, and that will also help curtail climate disrupting chemicals. It'll curtail development, so many things. So if you can protect the wild species, the ones that have been there much longer than any human ever, if we can help them, we've helped everybody. And that's what's important to me.
Well, there's a theme there. It's sort of underneath that idea of environmental justice, which is about the connectedness of everything.
Right.
I find that really fascinating because a lot of what we've talked about already is something about how people can connect with each other around
They can.
this whole matter of the fact that we're connected.
Right.
That's what's kind of fascinating about this particular issue, is it's something that it appears many people can recognize. There is a connecting link.
Right.
How we most recently connected was around this project that you have of the
Milagros.
Yes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. That came directly out of the writing process for this book. As I started working with kids where I lived in New Mexico. The first group was the Eco Kids Club, and a couple of kids are from the Taos Pueblo, but it doesn't really focus on that. But the kids themselves organized their own eco club. They did some monarch butterfly projects. They're wonderful kids. They're really amazing. So I'd been trying to work for a while on an earth liturgy was what I was interested. Music for us to feel much more deeply into the connectedness, and particularly for wildlands and wild species. So I've been working a bit with it to try and bring it out. I looked at a lot of other things that are done, like Paul Winter has this beautiful music. You know, he has a Misa Gaia, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted something ordinary people can do that's, you can't all buy his music. He'll make it available anyway. He's a great guy.
Mm-hmm.
But something we could do together. So I came up with making Milagros, like the Mexican, they're usually Mexican, but they're actually from all over the world. Everybody makes these ex votos. The ones most people know are from Mexico. So usually they're for, you know, asking for help or expressing gratitude. Somebody's sick, so you have a broken arm, so you get a Milagro shaped like an arm. And I noticed that there were no wild species in any of them. In the Mexican ex votos. Ex voto itself comes from the word vow. So for me, we vow to save all beings. We vow to help these species that we've pushed to the brink.
Mm-hmm.
We vow to honor our connections to them and work for the good of all.
Mm-hmm.
So I started doing that with the kids, and we made them out of paper, metallic paint on paper, and gluing them to board or cardboard. You could do it with that too. So it's very inexpensive. Anyone could do it. I developed it using kids' scissors, make sure we could all do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the kids just completely immersed themselves in it and felt and learned and took it further. No, they were great. They were great. So I want to take it to other places. I've had requests from other schools, usually art teachers connect to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to do this and spread it and use the music that I've talked to you about when we do a litany of what are the endangered species around you. And we say their names over the music. And then there'll be other pieces as well. I want to have a whole range of things that we can do. But I'm really looking mostly at doing it with kids groups and making it available to anybody all around. And I'm including Mexico and Canada. So that's the pulse that's continuing from writing this book.
And then there's a sort of a plan developing to do this tour again, get back on the road.
Yes, and I'm calling it the Wild Milagros Tour. And meanwhile, I can continue over the internet disseminate how you do make Milagros, like altar pieces, if you want to call them that, or it's just a reminder. I have a little one here, right behind you. I have a small one I put up here. This is the smallest size, and it's a Mexican wolf, a jaguar, ocelot, pronghorn. These are all endangered on the border. So sometimes the kids would make a small one like this, take home, and put on the wall as a reminder. That vow. I vow to help them. Whatever comes along in your life, that vow will carry you. You know, you stick with it. You see that every day. You remind yourself. And the opportunities will show up. Just like most of the people I spoke with who've done a lot of work on the watersheds, that's what it was for them too. They just stayed with it. They had a strong heart impulse, and they followed that up with a determination, a persistence, diligence, intelligence, and joy. So things would happen.
That's really beautiful. I think that's a good place to conclude.
Okay.
I love that. Yes. follow where the vow leads you.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So
We
beautiful.
vow to help them
Mm-hmm.
and get to know them too. You know,
Mhm.
a lot of people don't know that what's at risk.
Well, it's, I guess the one other thing that I'm finding fascinating about this is that the work with the children.
Yes.
Because, you know, they have this imagination, and it's
Yeah.
sort of like planting seeds for the future.
Right.
You know, if the next generation is going to be able to do the work that will be needed to,
Yeah.
you know, bring these changes about, then
Yeah.
they'll get pushed.
They're ready.
Yeah.
And they're smart. They're
Mhm.
really smart, and they're beautiful. Oh my
Mhm.
God! When we were making these, I made a bigger one. I started with the kids. They made one for their own group, and then schools can make larger ones. So I've got a much larger one now with all 94 endangered species of the U.S.-Mexico border. So when you see it, there's such diversity in those species that are at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like pulling a string. Those go, well, the next one's go,
Right.
and the next one's go.
Right.
So think about it. Think about the interrelations. Feel, you know, this, like the narrow-headed garter snake. It's a beautiful being. It could disappear from the whole earth.
Mm-hmm.
Could disappear soon. Or the
Mhm.
Mexican wolf.
Mm-hmm.
There are only 123 in the wild. They could be gone.
That story that gets told in the video that has gone around about the wolves returning to
Yes,
Yellowstone,
Yeah,
I think that's made so much impact on people.
it has.
Because it reminds you of that thing about connection and how all those
Yeah.
pieces work together.
You're bringing
All the
back
beings.
the beavers. There's so many.
Mm-hmm.
When you start to restore, it might not go the way you want, but it will go in some way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you reintroduce a crucial element to it, especially like a wolf, a keystone species.
Mhm.
So important.
Mm-hmm.
And the same with the Mexican wolf. They're beautiful, and they're crucial to those environments.
Mhm.
They're in the Gila Mountains. It's one of the last truly wild places. Not last, but it's one of the main ones.
Mm-hmm.
And they're important to that whole system.
And you say they too are nearing extinction?
They were down to 7 individuals at one point.
Really?
Yeah, and they were brought back through captive breeding.
Uh-huh.
So they're working to restore some genetic diversity. There are a lot of scientists on this now,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll do things like, you know, once they had packs developing in the Gilas, they would monitor them and find out when a mom is having pups. So the captive bred pups, they would select a good candidate and bring it to the wild mother for cross adoption, and it works.
Mm.
They're doing that.
Mm.
So there are a lot of intelligent people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, who work till they're exhausted sometimes to restore wildlife populations.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so good. Okay. I think we're
Alrighty.
good.
Thank you.
Yes.